Fred woke before dawn, as he had for most of his adult life. Sleep had become lighter with age, less a deep rest and more a quiet pause between thoughts. The coffee maker gurgled softly in the kitchen, filling the small house with a familiar, comforting sound. An old radio sat on the counter, tuned to a local station that played jazz and country from decades past. The music crackled faintly, as if it, too, were aging. He stood at the window while the coffee brewed, watching the street outside. The town was still asleep. The sidewalks were empty, the storefronts dark, their signs faded by years of sun and weather. This town in Ohio had never been remarkable, but it had been steady. It had raised families, buried friends, survived recessions and wars, and somehow kept going. Fred wrapped his hands around his mug and took a slow sip. The taste was strong, bitter, exactly the way he liked it. At 72, he no longer rushed mornings. There was no factory whistle calling him in, no children running late for school. Just time, quiet, patient time. When he stepped outside, the air was cool and smelled faintly of cut grass and asphalt warming under the rising sun. A dog barked somewhere down the block. A delivery truck rumbled past, carrying newspapers that fewer people seemed to read each year. "Morning, Fred," called Mary from across the street as she watered her flowers. "Morning," he replied, lifting his hand. He passed Tom's house, then Larry's, exchanging the same greetings they had shared for years. These small acknowledgments mattered more than people realized. They reminded him he was still part of something. The park was only a few blocks away. It had been there as long as he could remember, a patch of green surrounded by old oak trees whose branches twisted like arthritic fingers. Fred headed for his usual bench, the wood worn smooth by decades of use. He sat down carefully and scattered a few crumbs from his pocket. Pigeons fluttered down almost immediately, pecking at the ground with practiced confidence. This was how most of his days began. He had just settled into the quiet when a shadow fell across the path. Fred looked up to see a young man standing a few feet away, holding a baseball. The boy hesitated, shifting his weight from one foot to the other. "Excuse me," the young man said. "Are you Fred?" Fred squinted slightly. "Depends who's asking. My name's Jake. I just moved here. I heard. Well, people said you used to play baseball." Fred smiled despite himself. The words still carried weight. Baseball had once been the center of his world. "I did," he said. "A long time ago." Jake glanced at the ball in his hands. "I was wondering, would you mind teaching me? Just the basics." Fred studied the boy. He saw nervousness, hope, and something else. Uncertainty, the kind that came with starting over in a new place. "I suppose I could," Fred said at last, "if you're willing to listen." Jake's face brightened. "I am. I really am." They walked to the open field nearby, grass uneven in places, dirt packed hard from years of use. Fred showed Jake how to hold the bat, adjusting his grip gently. "Not too tight," Fred said. "You fight the bat, it fights you back." Jake swung and missed completely. "Don't worry," Fred said with a chuckle. "I've missed more times than I can count." They practiced slowly. Fred focused on fundamentals, not rushing anything. Between swings, he talked about patience, about discipline, about how baseball wasn't just a game. It was a lesson in timing, failure, and persistence. As the days passed, their routine settled in. Mornings in the park, afternoons on the field, evenings sitting on the bench, watching the light fade. Fred told stories about playing after the war, when the crack of a bat had felt like proof that life could still be simple. About teammates who never made it home. About factory shifts that paid the bills but wore down the body. Jake listened closely, rarely interrupting. One evening, Fred brought out an old box. Inside were photographs, yellowed letters, and baseball cards with curled edges. "That was my best hit," Fred said, pointing to a faded photo from 1952. "Didn't win us the championship, but I remember it like it was yesterday." Jake smiled. "You ever miss it?" "All the time," Fred said. "But missing something means it mattered." A month passed faster than Fred expected. Then came the game, Jake's first real one against the neighboring town. Fred sat on the bleachers, an old cap pulled low over his eyes. His hands were steady, but his stomach wasn't. Funny how nerves could return after all these years. Jake struck out early. Twice. Fred clapped anyway. Keep swinging, he called. And then, in the late innings, Jake connected. The sound was clean, sharp. The ball sailed high, dropping just beyond the reach of the outfielder. The crowd erupted. Fred felt something tighten in his chest. Not sadness, not regret. Pride. After the game, Jake ran toward the team, laughing, shouting. Fred stayed back, watching. That evening, he sat in his backyard as the sun dipped low. Pigeons moved along the fence. The town settled into its nighttime hush. Later, in the attic, Fred opened an old box. Photographs spilled out. War buddies, county fairs, a young woman smiling beside him. Each image carried a life he had lived fully, even when it hadn't felt that way at the time. The next morning, Fred returned to the park. The field was empty. A lone baseball rested in the grass. He picked it up, weighing in his hand. He took one slow swing. The ball arced gently and landed nearby. Fred smiled. Life, he realized, was just a series of swings. Some you missed. Some you hit clean. What mattered was stepping up to the plate. He walked home slowly, heart light, knowing he had passed something on. And that was enough. Fred thought that would be the end of it. Life, after all, had a way of closing chapters quietly, without ceremony. You finished the game, went home, sat down, and the world moved on. That was how it had always worked. But weeks passed, and Jake kept coming back. Sometimes he came to train. Sometimes he just sat beside Fred on the bench, talking about school, work, or nothing in particular. He asked fewer questions about baseball now and more about life, about choices, mistakes, about how a man knew when he was doing the right thing. Fred never gave speeches. He never believed in them. Instead, he told stories. He talked about the factory job he stayed at too long because it felt safe, about a friend who left town chasing opportunity and never came back, about a marriage that didn't survive the years, not because of betrayal or anger, but because two people slowly became strangers. People think big moments change your life, Fred said one afternoon, but it's the small ones, the ones you barely notice. Jake nodded, looking out the field. Fall arrived quietly. The leaves turned, the air sharpened, and the park grew emptier. Fred felt the change in his knees before he saw it in the trees. He moved more slowly now, sat longer. One morning, Jake didn't show up. Fred waited. Then he waited some more. He told himself it meant nothing. Young people were busy. Lives pulled them in different directions. Still, the bench felt a little colder. Winter came early that year. Snow settled on rooftops and sidewalks, muting the town. Fred stayed inside more, listening to the radio, rereading old letters. The house felt larger in winter, quieter. Then, one afternoon in early spring, there was a knock at the door. Jake stood there, older somehow, more certain. I got into a college team, he said, almost embarrassed. Not a big one, but it's a start. Fred felt his throat tighten. That's good, he said. That's very good. Jake hesitated, then reached into his bag and pulled out a baseball. On it, written carefully in ink, were the words, "Keep swinging. I figured you should have this," Jake said. Fred took the ball, turning it slowly in his hands. They didn't hug. They didn't need to. Years passed. Fred aged the way towns do, gradually, then all at once. His steps shortened. His hearing softened. Some mornings, he stayed in bed longer, listening to the house breathe. The park bench remained. Sometimes children played on the field. Sometimes no one did. Fred watched when he could. One afternoon, long after Jake had left, a man in a college jacket walked past the park. He slowed, stopped, and looked at the field. Fred recognized him immediately. Jake smiled. "I still play," he said. "Not professionally, but enough." They sat together in silence. The sun dipped low, just as it always had. Fred leaned back on the bench, feeling the weight of the years, the games, the conversations, the quiet mornings. He had not built anything grand. He had not left his name behind. But he had mattered. And in the end, Fred realized that was the truest kind of victory there was.